Welcome back to the Lead in Detection podcast. I'm your host, Matt, aka the Fraud Detection Recruiter. Now, today we're going to be talking about LLMs in fraud detection, and who better to speak to than Chen Zamir, formerly of PayPal, former co-founder of Frogster in Berlin, and now leading Native Risk, which is the consulting firm specializing in fraud prevention. Yeah, we're digging into LLMs, where they can be used, where we should be cautious, where the best opportunities are. And we all talk about the love triangle between rules, ML models, and LLMs. Will they work together? Is one going to get the cold shoulder? Really good deep dive into LLMs and where they're actually going to be useful in fraud detection. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Lead in Detection podcast. Fascinating episode we have in store today. We're going to be talking about leveraging LLMs and what that means in fighting fraud. And who's better to talk about this topic than Chen? So a lot of people will know him from his newsletter and a lot of the work he does within fraud. But yeah, really excited to dive into this topic with him today. So Chen, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for inviting me to the show.
No, it's going to be a great conversation. I know the topic is very close to your hearts. A lot of people are talking about it. AI is a bit of a buzzword, but of course, LLMs is fundamental to that. So let's set the scene. LLMs, what do we mean by this, and particularly what we're talking about when we're talking about LLMs within fraud?
Sure. So I'll start with a disclaimer I always give. I'm not an LLM expert. I'm not an expert on mostly anything. But when we're talking about LLMs, large language models, we're talking about algorithms that help, basically predict the right order of the correct words to appear as an answer to a question. So you send a query and the result would be the algorithm's best guess as to which words should appear there and at which order. So if you think about it, it is very similar to the autocomplete function on your phone, but just much more sophisticated. And today, after the big explosion of ChatGPT 3.5, over the past 2 years, these models have become very sophisticated. On top of the basic LLM functionality, we now have other functionalities like searching the web, like being able to agentically operate on the web, like being able to implement workflows that fetch data and consume data, like being able to code, right? Yeah. Also as a manifestation of choosing the right words in the right order. So that's basically what LLMs are. And what we're seeing over the past 2 years, and mainly I would say 1 year, the last year, we're seeing obviously that the fraud prevention industry, like any other industry on the face of the earth in the last couple of years, has started to take a very good look at how we can utilize LLMs to fight fraud better, basically. And there are all sorts of different aspects to it. There are all sorts of different schools. There are all sorts of different implementations and roads and paths you can take. But that's kind of like just to ground us and put us in terms of like paint the picture, like the high level picture of where we are as an industry. So I would say very, very early stages of looking at this new technology and understanding what can be done with it, and even earlier steps of taking action and actually doing something with it.
Yeah, because it's not perfect. It's got a lot of issues, not just in fraud, but across the board. Hallucinations are probably the headline, but it is getting better. It is starting to be able to work for longer periods autonomously as well. Companies are starting to introduce AI agents in other industries, who knows, in fraud. But right now, practical use cases for LLMs, where are the obvious ones? Where are maybe a bit abstract that have potential but have high risk? So yeah, starting with the obvious practical use cases.
Yeah. So in general, I think where LLMs excel, definitely in the moment, this is definitely where their competency is the most, I would say, baked, is with automating manual processes that we're used to do manually. And so in a chat environment where you have a conversation, right? That was basically the premise of ChatGPT. And so, of course, when the industry or when the business industry started implementing it, it went to the direction of chatbots. But within the fraud prevention space, the first manual process that comes to mind is fraud investigations.
Yeah.
So basically, sitting down as a human being and reviewing a case and deciding whether it is fraudulent or not, whatever that means, whatever fraud means in this particular context. And I think that over the last 12 to 18 months, this is the main thing that we've seen most vendors and most in-house teams try to tackle with LLMs, because that was kind of like the top of mind
Yeah.
use case that people were thinking of. And indeed, we see a lot of tools today out there in the market that are basically they are either labeled as AI agents that do investigations completely autonomously, or as co-pilots that help analysts or investigators to retrieve data, to retrieve insights, to automate some of the more smaller banal tasks of investigation, but not do that manually, just help the human being or enhance the human being's ability to conduct an investigation that is very, very efficient, meaning accurate and fast.
So it's very much complementing, it's not replacing. Do you see any sign of replacing the current fraud teams, or are we always at the moment going to see human analysts
It's
there?
a very good question. It's a very good question. I keep getting, I myself, I'm going back and forth about it. I think that first, it is too early to say. The technology has progressed massively in the last 2 years, and we don't know where we will be in 5 years' time. This is the question number one. Question number two comes to trust. There's in any technology that we implement, especially technology that we don't really understand fully, there's an element of trust, and the adoption rate is very much linked to it, to your level of trust. So I'm not sure that businesses, now, even if you would be able to show them a clear proof that they can replace their entire team, and I'm not sure that we're there, but let's say that we were, even then, I'm not sure that businesses would do that just yet. Because I think there's an element of trust that builds over multiple years and years of experience dealing with this technology that we as an industry don't have yet. And lastly, I am not sure if it is really a question of 0 or 1, like will that replace investigators or not, rather than will it help businesses keep the investigation teams relatively small to their scale. So it might be that we won't see businesses growing their investigation teams as much as they were they would do that in the past, but I'm not sure that they would just shut them down completely.
So humans going to be around. The trust doesn't look like it's going to get there either, to have complete autonomous agents running fraud detection. But with human analysts in the loop and other fraud specialists, ML engineers, etc. So when it comes to fraud, how can LLMs help humans find new patterns, or maybe even look towards ML scoring as well?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. So I think it kind of like leads the way to a more hidden way, or a more hidden manner in which humans participate in fraud detection in the form of manual processes. So we talked about investigations. That's kind of like the clear use case.
Yeah.
And when we look at how a fraud system looks like, usually it's very hard, like we would be hard pressed to find another manual process, right? Because the rest is automation, it's rules, it's machine learning. But when you peel off this surface layer, what you find out is that, yes, these rules and these models, they take automated decisions, but how did they came to be? Like, how were they researched? How were they developed? How were they deployed? How were they monitored? So there are a lot of processes. Some of them are core R&D processes. Some of them are analytical processes. Some of them are software engineering processes that have to do with the entire life cycle of researching, developing, testing, deploying, and monitoring automated solutions. And I think this area, whether it is within the rule writing space or whether it is within the machine learning model space, I think this area is much less explored in terms of what LLMs can bring there. And I'm convinced that there's a lot of potential that we still haven't started to seriously look at.
Is there, I mean, there's like people coming out and saying LLMs are kind of hit the ceiling. We need to start looking at world models instead of just language models because the world doesn't run on just language. Do you see this in fraud detection as well? There's been mention of large transaction modeling in theory. It's very, very new. In theory, is this something that could supplement as well?
So in theory, yes. I am not convinced 100% that we will ever see it. And even if we will see it, that it would be in the next 5 years. I am very, very skeptical. And I think there are multiple reasons here, are mainly hardware, right? The costs, the latency, there are like physical limitations to what we can do. And these physical limitations are not solved overnight. But regardless, there are a lot of subtleties to researching and implementing a score to detect and prevent fraud. And LLMs, like any other thing in the world, including machine learning, has their pros and has their cons. And they might be better in certain things when you compare them to machine learning models, but they might be completely or like much worse. One of the things that I keep mentioning is reproducibility. It is very hard to ask an LLM a question, even if it is exactly the same question, and get exactly the same answer back. It is very hard. And once you cannot do that, it sounds very silly. Like, why do we care about it?
Yeah.
But it is very hard to test models in a consistent way. It is very hard to reproduce errors. It is very hard to reproduce mistakes when we're, creating false positives. So and by the way, if it's very hard to reproduce, then we also lose some of the trust that we have. That we wouldn't, we know that this is a piece of code that does exactly what we want it to do. And this element of randomness and the fact that it influences trust, this is exactly, it goes back to the point of how fast would we be in really harnessing and implementing this technology. Having said that, I don't think it's really the right question. I don't think the question is whether LLMs should or would replace machine learning. I don't see it in that way at all. The question is, what is the place of LLMs in fraud prevention or fraud management? What are the tests that they are best utilized for? How do we harness that technology for these use cases? And I always say, we as fraud fighters, we deal with a very wide set of problems that mostly are very intricate and hard to solve.
Yeah.
And we need a toolbox filled with a variety of tools that can do all sorts of things. And every time that we face a specific problem, we need to choose which tool we want to use or which combination of tools sometimes. So to me, the question is not whether LLMs will ever replace machine learning. I think it's a waste of time and resources to focus on that. I think the more interesting question is, how can I utilize LLMs today to do things that neither machine learning or rules can do?
And where are the areas that need supplementing? So rules and ML models have been working side by side. LLMs plug in the gaps. Is it just kind of efficiency for now and optimizing, automating processes as opposed to getting into the fraud detection? How do you see it?
Honestly, I do feel I've been taking a very wide versus deep, a very wide look at how LLMs can be utilized for fraud prevention. And I haven't seen a capability that I would say is completely new and is bring a new, something new to the table that didn't exist before. But what LLMs are or I would say it like that. what makes LLMs very attractive in my mind is that they make certain capabilities very, very simple, easy, fast, and cheap to deploy, like to research and develop and deploy, right? And these capabilities you might have needed to have like a world-class team to even contemplate going after such a project in the past. I'll give just a very simple example. When I was working at PayPal, that was whatever, 15 years ago, one of the flagship projects of the R&D team it was a project called True Industry. And the idea was basically to scrape the entire, for example, eBay catalog in terms of sellers
Yeah.
and appoint to each seller the true industry that they operate within. Like, what do they actually sell? Because as an eBay seller, you can define your own industry in the
Yeah.
eBay catalog, but might be that you're selling something different, either for nefarious or non-nefarious reasons. And so first it's about scraping the web. And secondly, it's about algorithmically going over the text, the images, whatnot, and deciding what is the most likely industry that within it you operate. That has been a huge project that was developed over years with at least 10 different data scientists and analysts and engineers around it, not to mention the scraping side, like the web scraper. And today, this is something that an LLM can do very easily. It's not a new capability, but suddenly, not only that, it is much cheaper for me to do and much faster. But now, and this is, I think, the real breakthrough. Now, almost every team can do that. I don't need any special skill sets for that. So it's enough that I have this idea. It's enough that I listen to this podcast. And I can probably have an MVP running in the next couple of weeks. It is very, very likely. And I think this is a major breakthrough. And it is so big that I don't think that we necessarily need to find what LLMs can do that nothing else can do to make it worthwhile.
Yeah. So just superpowering the capabilities that we already have, speeding it up, making it the barrier to entry much lower, the cost of resource, bringing that right down.
Yes, and especially in R&D, because if you think about it, R&D, when you manage R&D at scale, it's very hard for me to think about another business area where you invest a lot of money and potentially you get nothing for it. So there's a very high likelihood that your project would fail. And there's also a very high likelihood that until you realize it failed, it takes a long time, a lot of resources, and a lot of budget. And suddenly, when you have the ability to be much more open with the bets that is a game changer to a lot of teams when it comes to fraud prevention, which is an area that is very R&D heavy.
If we talk about fintech and payment providers, are we able to make these mistakes so openly? I mean, if you talk about creative space, if an image gets created and it deforms in some way, it's a little bit funny, right? It's a meme. Whereas if we're making mistakes in fraud, then there's going to be issues. There's going to be someone to explain to or need to be explained to. So how do we balance that need for failure and learning and the high risk area that we're trialing LLMs within fraud usually is fintechs and payments?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the good news. Everyone makes mistakes. The same goes, as LLMs make mistakes, the same goes to humans, to machine learning models, to expert written rules, and so on. So mistakes is part of the human experience, and it is definitely part of fraud prevention. And we know that there are basically two types of mistakes that you can do. You can miss fraud and get the losses, or you can create false positives by wrongly blocking good users. These are the mistakes that we manufacture daily, especially at systems that run at scale. I don't see this ever changing. That's part of the problem. That's part of what excites me about this problem. You can never really solve it. So I think it's more of a question how much trust and confidence you have when you implement a specific process, no matter what is the vehicle for this process. Is it a rule? Is it an LLM model? Whatever. how much trust and confidence you have in it. And this pertains to the experience and what I just said, like how confident and how comfortable the team feels with implementing this technology. And the other point is, I think, at least this is how I see it at the moment, LLMs in my mind, their main strength is not necessarily in making decisions. They can make decisions. I'm not sure if they are the best vehicle that we have right now to make decisions, but instead recommend decisions, or instead automate processes that before that we could only do manually without a very high level of investment. And so while we keep LLMs operating in the background in, like facilitating decisions and automating a lot of the workload, I think this is how we will gain the experience and the confidence and the trust. And slowly we will see more and more teams making wholesale, even real-time decisions with LLMs.
So what are the safeguards? We're talking about being a bit cautious. What are the crucial, critical safeguards that we need to put in place? You say people fail. We have to experiment a little bit. You have to be smart about where you're trialing it. But when we're talking about safeguards, what are the critical ones that need to be in place?
Yeah. So I can think about two that I would urge any team to consider when they're starting to experiment with LLMs. The first one would be that, even taking it a step backward, one of the biggest biases and most invisible biases that humans have, especially analysts. And when I say analysts, I mean basically people that make decisions using data. That's my broad
blanket.
Yeah, exactly. And analysts, when they look at a data set and they make a decision, a data set like payments, what was fraud, what was not fraud, it's very easy to narrow down the entire world and point of view to this data set. And it's very easy to forget that there's a whole reality outside of this data set. There's who constructed this data set, what kind of population went into it, who chose to show this data in the data set and not other data. So there are a lot of considerations to think about. And when it comes to fraud prevention, it is very obvious. Meaning, I'll give an example. I can build a data set that by pure chance, and it's not going to be an uncommon event, by pure chance would have Gmail email addresses to have very little correlation to fraud. And as an analyst, I might think that Gmail is the safest email provider in the world. That is not true, right? We see a lot of fraud coming from Gmail, but for some reason, maybe in this data set, you don't have a lot of fraud. Hopefully, as a human analyst, you won't make this mistake. You would realize that Gmail is an open, free email account without any kind of like KYC and identity verification. And this is just, a statistical flux. And I will also start to think why does my data look the way it does, right? Because it makes no sense. The LLM would not have this reasoning, right? An LLM would not conclude that, yes, there is this data correlation, but we shouldn't take that into account.
It won't take that.
It won't. So LLMs perceive the data set as the world, and unless you work very hard on training them to take into account a lot of other considerations that exist outside of your data set, your business, fraud topologies, how fraud evolves, and how fraudsters would react to your defenses. So unless you do that, and it is very, very hard to do that consistently and successfully, it is very hard for an LLM to not fall into these biases that humans tend to fall to as well, but maybe not as much.
Yeah, fall out of them a lot quicker.
Yes, definitely. When I play with LLMs, this is the main reason why I see that they are very far from being able to automate the decisions completely, because especially not on a case level, but on a workflow level, when I want to release a rule or a workflow or machine learning model, this is the main problem. And this is why you need to have a human in the loop. The other issue is that LLMs, again, like humans, but maybe more easily tend to profile or to stick to profiling much more. It's almost the same root cause that I just mentioned, right? But here, I think other than the fact that you're making analytical mistakes, like you're reaching the wrong conclusions, here you're doing things that risk like you being compliant with all sorts of acts, right? Both in the US and in the EU. And in general, I don't think that morally this is the kind of decisions that you want to make, because as a human, you wouldn't. And I think LLMs, without realizing it, would be much more trigger happy when it comes to profiling.
And that would just train themselves again and it just make it worse and worse, right?
Yes. And these are things that you can argue that machine learning models are very much the same here, but machine learning models tend to look less at, like the name in context with gender, with ethnicity, or with the geographic location of where you are. So it's more about like contextually picking up on a couple of signals and then acting on them.
So is this kind of going to be the evolution? It's not there yet, but we need to kind of plug in LLMs are not very good numerically, and ML models aren't very good with context. So is that where we need to try and fuse? Is that going to be the evolving fraud tech stack?
Yeah, I think where LLMs do a lot of very good, they perform very well in a number of tasks. I think when you compare them to machine learning, one of the tasks that kind of comes to mind immediately is their ability to find patterns within single data points. So machine learning, usually after you train the model and the patterns are kind of like known and mapped, and you have an algorithm with variables and weights, and now it's just mathematics. With LLMs, there's much more going into analyzing single data points, especially textual data points. So again, names, addresses, any kind of user input that might count with your event, and also connecting and contextualizing different data points together. So LLMs can on the fly find new features. For example, say, what was the last example that I encountered? Yeah. I fed a data set to an LLM, and without defining any kind of feature like that in the data set, and without this data appearing as is, it realized that fraud tends to happen very fast after account sign up, and kind of like created a new feature that basically measured the time to transaction, from account sign up to transaction. And that's something that unless you detect yourself and build a feature for, a machine learning model would not be able to take into account. And LLMs spots it like that. That's the difference.
Yeah. Okay. And in the kind of evolving love triangle in fraud, we have rules, which have been around for a long time, and they were shortly partnering up with ML models. And now we've got a third member on the block with LLMs. Do you think it'll be a case where LLMs and ML models will start partnering up and rules will start getting the cold shoulder? Or is it going to be a love triangle that's going to continue to...
The more the merrier.
Yeah.
The more the merrier. So yeah, I recently wrote a LinkedIn post where I kind of like reflected on the fact that for 15 years, my first 15 years in fraud, I used to find myself defending rules and trying to make the case why rules would never go out of style, even though we have machine learning. And what changed in the last year is that now I need to defend machine learning and explain why machine learning would not go out of style because we have LLMs. So as I said before, I think there's room for all three approaches and all three automation vehicles. I think each of them excels in different environments. So I think here's how I see it. I think that machine learning is very good at creating a kind of like one size fits all blanket scoring and segmentation of your population.
Yeah.
Basically, kind of like, like helping you understand where the hit marks in terms of fraud. And it's not super accurate in my mind when you compare it to other means.
Yeah.
But it helps you to create this fundamental base layer. On that, you can overlay rules. And rules usually you would use to pinpoint very specific solutions that you need them to be very, very accurate. So this can be to pinpoint a very specific fraud trend that your model is not good enough at catching, or this can be at pinpointing a specific type of false positive that you keep catching with your. And I think where LLMs would come in is, in my mind, at least for now, less so in the decisioning, but much more in the orchestration. So first, the entire phase, the entire process of researching, developing, and deploying said elements, rules, and models, but also making decisions. For example, it can make decisions in terms of which data sources to query, which rules to fire and which rules not to fire, which models do I want to fit to which transaction. So I can do a lot of orchestration with LLMs that would actually replace. So today we don't do any of that. Why? Because these are processes that today we only have humans to do. And it's too complex to do that in real time. But if you now have LLMs that are able to mimic the way that humans think about things, and they can operate in next to real time, not real time, but near real time. This is where I think LLMs can make an impact.
Okay. And so, final question. Are we, when it comes to fraud, are we getting better at detecting? Are we improving? Or are we still just keeping up? The fraud attacks are getting more complicated. The systems, the tooling, everything is becoming more complicated. So we're keeping busy, busier than ever, some may argue. Are we getting anywhere, or are we still just
It's a very interesting question.
floating?
It's a very interesting question. So sadly, my experience on an industry level is, or at least how it feels to me, is that we're treading water.
That's not the phrase I was looking for. That was the phrase I was looking for.
We're not really going anywhere. Now, you can make an argument that, and it is like a true argument for sure, that the environment keeps getting much more complex. If you look at fintech or even e-commerce today, and let's roll back 10 years, it was so basic 10 years ago, which would have meant a much smaller surface of attack, much fewer attack vectors and fraud topologies. And so you could argue that, like if 10 years ago you had to be good at solving like 3 fraud topologies, today you need to be able to solve like 20 easily with first-party fraud and scams and all of that. You can argue that regulations are, keeping us maybe half blindfolded. You can argue that fraudsters themselves are, because we talked a lot about LLMs in the use of fraud prevention, but LLMs and Gen AI in general are definitely being used by fraudsters to commit much more sophisticated fraud for much cheaper than before. So you can argue that there are a lot of headwinds, and therefore, even though we're getting better, it still feels like we're in the same place. Having said that, and it's all true, many times I feel that, I come into organizations to help them with fraud prevention, and most of the time we're talking about basics. We're talking about the fundamentals. We're talking about solving problems that have been solved hundreds of times, decades ago. And so I think part of the equation here is that we also have a lot of new businesses, whether it is on the e-commerce side or on the fintech side, maybe less so on the FI side. A lot of new businesses that come in, grab market share, but they are completely new in terms of managing fraud, and they need to build and learn and experience and fail and succeed from the start. That is why I feel that as an industry, even though some organizations for sure are way better than they were 10 years ago, as a rule, I don't think as an industry we are.
Not all doom and gloom, but it is a fight. It is still a fight. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, on that final topic, we probably could have kept going, but it's been an absolute pleasure having you join us. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on. You're now founder of your own business. So, tell us a little bit more about native risk.
Sure. So native risk is
Second time founder, sorry.
yes, native risk is a much less complicated business than a full-fledged fraud prevention vendor. Native risk is a consulting firm. We specialize in fraud strategy, and we mainly advise fintechs on fraud strategy topics, right? This can be build or buy, this can be vendor selection, this can be setting up the policies, the organizational structure, and so on. Okay, so that's native risk. And other than that, you can find my musings and writings in two places. The first one is my weekly newsletter, the Saturday Fraud Strategist, that goes out every, Saturday. And it's aimed to anyone that is curious about fraud and anyone that is curious about fintech. I usually or mostly write about fraud prevention in fintech, and feel free to sign up. And the other thing that I'm currently working on is the Fraud Fighters AI Playbook, which is a new
Oh,
book
nice.
that I'm writing, together with two of my co-authors, so Gilead Saporta and Shoshana Marani. And this should be published next year in 2026. We're aiming for the first half of 2026, but
Yep.
the first three chapters are out now in an early release form on the O'Reilly website. It's free. Check it out. A lot of the topics that we've discussed today are in there. So if you like this talk, you'll find it very interesting.
Amazing. Well, yeah, if listeners can find you on LinkedIn, I'm sure they'll be sending a connection and keeping in touch, and definitely subscribe to the newsletter. I think it's great when it comes in on a Saturday. It's not amongst all the other emails in the week, and you can just browse for it over the weekend. So thank you for putting that together for myself, and to the listeners, definitely check it out. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Hen. And yeah, to listeners, until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you.